Okay, welcome to Philly.net. This is our September monthly meeting. Good to see you all back here. We're expecting a little bit bigger crowd here, but looks like we have about 30 or so far. We are once again broadcasting all of this live on Twitch and Mixer and YouTube. And all of the presentations tonight, as we've been doing for almost the last year, are going to be available on YouTube in our Philly.net site. So, good to see you all here. We got a couple of things coming up this fall. We are doing a series of labs. For those of you that don't do Philly.net all the time, we do one monthly meeting a month, except for those months that we have camps. And then we also do one lab per month in the hands-on lab series. We just started, we're going to do 3 months on GitHub. So we learned all about Git 2 weeks ago from the command line and how it works internally. And then in 3 more weeks, we're doing GitHub. And then in November, we're doing like tooling and integration with things like Visual Studio Code. And since we're in that mode of doing Git, starting in December and rolling into January and February, we're going to spend 3 months doing the new devops.azure.com, which is the new continuous integration pipeline, the Kanban boards, automated testing, all that neat stuff that's all rolled into Azure now, and that was just announced just 2 weeks ago or so. So monthly meetings. We don't have a speaker yet for next the October meeting, but that meeting will also be on DevOps, the new Azure DevOps site. So I'll tell you about CodeCamp in a few minutes, but before I do, tonight's sponsor is actually the Tech Bash conference, and I'm going to turn this over to Alvin, and he'll tell you about what's happening at Tech Bash.
All right, thanks, Bill. So I'm Alvin Ashcraft, one of the organizers of Tech Bash. It's a 3-day conference up in the Poconos, coming up in 2 weeks, October 2nd to the 5th. And it's the 2nd to the 5th because we have a pre-conference day this year, so it's actually 4 days with the full-day workshops on Tuesday. So you can buy a 1-day, a 3-day, or a 4-day ticket for that. And we've got workshops on Azure DevOps, and Azure for Developers, Docker, and ASP.NET Core. And let's see, we've got Scott Hunter keynoting. You can see there on the screen. He'll be coming in for Thursday's keynote, and on Wednesday. Yeah, for some reason he's bigger. We've got Jeff Fritz coming for the welcome session, and he'll be doing a couple other sessions there as well. And let's see what else. We've got a giveaway that we've done here. So we had a contest. I don't know if you saw in the email that went out for the meeting, but we are giving away a ticket. You can have a 3-day or a 4-day ticket if you're the winner. And for everyone else who entered, we're giving a little discount that we'll email you afterwards. And for anyone who didn't get to enter, we have a code PhillyNet40. So PhillyNet40. That will give you $40 off any 3 or 4 days. That's just yours. All right, so let's do the winner. So we picked a random winner. It's Chandra Pavan Pulli. Over here? He's not here. All right, well, he still wins. We'll email him, and then everyone else will get an email from us with the other code.
Excellent. All right. Okay. So we thank Tech Bash a lot. They paid for the refreshments tonight. And that helps us out, but we've been promoting their event for the last couple months, and it is very worthwhile, especially if you have young families. This is a premier resort, and it has the largest water park in the country right now. And I guarantee the water is cleaner than it is in North Carolina. Ooh, they're having problems there, aren't they? All right. So, the other thing we need to remind you about, anybody remember CodeCamps? See, I've got a shirt that says CodeCamp. Okay. So, we're going to do a CodeCamp November 16th and 17th. It's going to be similar to what you've seen in the past. However, We are working with Microsoft. We are going to keep the crowd smaller so we don't overfill the rooms. We're probably going to charge the same amount for Friday when we have the full day training session, so that'll be very similar. There will be a modest charge for Saturday. And since there won't be that many tickets available for Saturday, they'll go pretty quickly. So usually we sell 300 for the Friday event, and then some percentage of those people come back the next day, and we might sell another like 75 tickets just that only give you entrance for Saturday. So that's what we're planning to do. It hasn't been as easy finding sponsors as it used to be in the past. We did co-camps where we had 25 sponsors. And all that money that we brought in is what pays for our meetings over the years. But it's just not as easy to find the sponsors as it used to be. So, look for an announcement towards the end of next week. The full day sessions will go on sale October 2nd, and the full day training is November 16th, and then the Saturday sessions are November 17th. How many think they're still going to go? I'm going. All right, well, that's enough. Well, technically it's on the Philly.net.org website still, but as always, it's easier just to email me, and I will help you through that. So, all right, any other questions or comments? Excellent. Well, at this time, I'm going to turn this over to Mike Molesky. He will introduce himself and get you started learning.
Okay, cool. Let's shut this down. Let's bring this thing up. Yeah, there's a spelling mistake in SQLite, but I'll fix that. get the crux of the talk. Hello. Yeah, welcome to Effective.NET Core Unit Testing with SQLite and Dapper. I put the word effective on there. If I didn't have the word effective, then it would just be .NET Core Unit Testing with SQLite and Dapper. So, Bill told me to be entertaining. I'll try my best to do that. I'm Mike. I'm a developer in Baltimore. I work for a company called Audacious Inquiry. Been there for about 4 years. I teach at Penn State. I'm adjunct at Penn State as well, too. Teach programming there. I like yard work. I like smoking meat. I like grilling. I like video games. Usually I put a video game that I play on my slide here, but unfortunately I beat Spider-Man last night, so I'm kind of hunting for. Yeah, it was pretty good. And if somebody asks me about Shadow of the Tomb Raider, yeah, I beat that already too. That was pretty good. So I gotta find something in the backlog to play until Assassin's Creed Odyssey comes out. But yeah, that's a bit about me. I've spoke here a few times. I've spoke at the code camps a number of times. I spoke at the monthly. I actually came to the monthly group last August. I spoke in front of Jeff Fritz, which was kind of cool. When he came and introduced .NET Standard last year, I thought that was a lot of fun. So yeah, why did I come here? Why did I burn PTO to talk about unit testing? So some topics for all this. I'm going to give a motivation. People were asking, why in the world am I talking about .NET Core unit testing? I'll talk about that tonight. And then I have a little real-world example I thrown together of how to integrate, how I like integrating .NET unit tests in the .NET Core. I'll go over that as well. And then I'll give you some closing thoughts, tips and tools I learned about testing from other people as well, too. Okay, the code for the night. So Bill was mentioning Git and GitHub. I have the project up on GitHub right now. I have a little starter.NET project. Let me shut this thing down here. So yeah, you can see there's the project. It's up on GitHub. You can probably clone this in the Visual Studio, clone it into whatever IDE you want to use to play along with the code if you want. So what I'm going to do after this is all done, I'll push the changes I make to the project up on GitHub, and then you can pull it and have fun with it. It's your code. Do whatever you want then. Okay, but where were we at before? Okay, so why are we doing a talk on unit testing? Why am I doing a talk on unit testing? First, let me change this to duplicate slideshow. That's better. Okay, why am I doing a talk on unit testing? Okay, so has anybody read the Stack Overflow dev survey or heard the developer survey Stack Overflow does? Yeah, every year Stack Overflow does a developer survey, basically probing developers, what languages they use, what technologies they use. Do you like Star Wars or Star Trek? What time of the day do you wake up? Stuff like that. Um, yeah, that's what that. So every year they poll developers, asking questions to gauge popular languages and frameworks and technologies. So for people who know me, I use JetBrains tools, and like people think I get paid by them to push their stuff. I don't. I like their products. They're very good. JetBrains, the company, I'm sure a lot of people use ReSharper, or I use IntelliJ a lot. I'm a Java guy by trade, and the code that I am actually going to be doing, I'm using Rider. That's my main IDE for C# lately. So JetBrains, who makes those products, and they make Kotlin, they make Android Studio, they've started making their own survey. I think so. This is the second year they've done the survey. They call it the State of the Developer Ecosystem. And so why am I here? Well, I was going over the survey and I saw something very alarming in that survey about unit testing. So there's an alarming survey response to a question regarding unit testing in that JetBrains survey. So here it is. And this is pretty scary, I think. So it says, do you use unit testing in your projects? And yes, I use unit tests. Yes, I write unit tests. Yes, I use unit tests, but I don't write them, whatever that means. And no. And this is alarming for me. I'm not going to basically poll people. I don't want to call anybody out saying, okay, who writes unit tests, who doesn't write unit tests. Based on that survey that JetBrains threw together, I could make the assumption 4 out of 10 developers have untested applications, which is pretty scary. And there's a number of reasons why for that, but the big thing in the big thing in that survey, the main language from the people who were polled in that JetBrains survey was Java. And so, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. What exactly is unit testing? It's testing individual units of code. And that's what unit testing is, very simple. There's a number of frameworks available for doing unit testing. So me, I'm a Java guy by trade, and I use JUnit, I use Mockito. Those are really nice. They integrate with Spring Framework, really nice. I'll talk about .NET, why I'm getting into the .NET Core as well. I talked a little bit before we started. .NET has a number of frameworks as well. XUnit's lovely. I like XUnit a lot. NUnit, I don't think it isn't supported anymore. At least I'll talk about that as well. XUnit's basically what NUnit used to be. There's something called MS Test, which I've never used in my life. I don't know if anybody uses it. And mock is pretty cool for making mocks of objects. I'll show you that as well. And then in JavaScript land, there are many unit testing frameworks, from Jest if you do React. Obviously, Cucumber and Protractor are there for the React developers. There's Mocha, there's Enzyme. There's many of them. It's very interesting. Okay, so back to the Java stuff. The JetBrains people the people who respond to JetBrains are Java developers, and I'm a Java guy myself. I love Spring. Spring Framework's really nice. Java makes it so easy to do unit testing because Spring Framework recommends that you have 2 separate source trees in your project, one called main and one called test. And in my opinion, there's no excuse not to do unit testing just because you have two separate source trees. And there's many projects I go into. The main branch will be populated with code. The test branch will be barren, nothing in there, and that's not cool. So hopefully we're going to talk about how to resolve that tonight. Okay, but how about .NET? That's what I'm here for. So again, about me, I'm a Java guy by trade. I have that scarlet letter on me. The bulk of my code is written I'm writing in Java 8, JDK 8, and I use Spring Boot 2. The database I use Postgres for my production database. And testing, I use JUnit and Mockito. And again, both of those integrate into Spring Framework very, very nice. So what we're basically using using .NET Core is building like a RESTFUL API. If you're a back-end developer, building that API so front-end developers who make the Xamarin apps, make the iOS apps, make the React Native apps, they can consume your data and integrate with the back-end. So building a RESTful API, you generally layer your back-end application is layered into the following components. You have a controller layer. So the controller handles any HTTP request and responses from the clients. You have a service layer, which applies transactional business logic and validation. And then lastly is you have that repository layer, your data access layer. However you want to implement, that's up to you. You can do straight SQL. You can use an ORM. So I'm going to be showing you tonight something called Dapper. And I know a few people here are using Dapper as well. I started with Entity Framework on a project recently, and then I switched over to Dapper, and I'm glad I made that switch. I like Dapper a lot. It's really cool, really lightweight. But there's other ones. Hibernate's one I use on the Java land. Obviously JPA, Entity Framework, and there's many others as well too. Okay, so Java unit tests, as mentioned, so my live database is a production Postgres database. So all my application code, my repository is connected to a Postgres database. For my unit tests, however, I'm connected to a different database. So when I run my unit tests, I'm connecting to an in-memory database. And the in-memory database I'm using for the unit tests in Java is a database called H2. It's a database that's basically ran in the JVM. You can deploy as a jar file. It's basically what that is. Recently, where I work, I had to build a .NET Core 2 application. It's basically a big back-end data application. The production database they have that we work with is Microsoft SQL Server. So that was the big issue. So what I had to do, what I wanted to do is I wanted to use the same testing strategies that I use in Java. I wanted to do the same thing that I'm doing in .NET. That is the data access layer code, queries, SQL Server in production, but I'm going to use an in-memory database for my unit test. That was my goal behind what I wanted to do for this, for the project. And it works out pretty well. I'm going to show you the tricks I used for doing that. I'll show you Dapper, SQLite, and some other cool stuff as well too. Okay, so back to the real-world application. So assume there's a company out there called XYZ WIDGET Corporation, and yeah, assume all of us recently got hired to go work at XYZ WIDGET Corporation. We read the reviews on Glassdoor, we got the offer letter, and we start our first day next Monday. So our first task as an employee of this company is we want to find a way to integrate unit testing into a brand. So developers on the team wrote a .NET Core application, and management was complaining because there's no unit tests on that. So what we need to do as an employee is integrate testing into this application that the dev team wrote. Okay, so let me show you what I have so far here. I have a .NET Core application. So first things first, the application, it connects to SQL Server, Microsoft SQL Server. I have a SQL Server database here, and for the sake of this demo, it's only one table. One table called widget, and you can see there's two fields. There's a widget ID and a widget name. Widget ID is a primary key. It's an auto-incrementing primary key, and widget name is the name of the widget. So you can just do a query of the day. You can see I have 4 records in my database, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's where our production data is going to come from, is that. So here's the .NET Core. I threw together a .NET Core application. This is .NET Core 2.0. And I know .NET Core 2.1's out as of like last month as well. And I know the improvements they made the 2.1 are significant, because I believe Microsoft recently upgraded the Bing backend to use 2.1, and they put a post on Channel 9 about it, and they showed the latency graphs, the big improvements they made on 2.1. So I really wanted to make this 2.1. It's still using .NET Core 2.0 as well too. So, but it's a 2.0 application. I have everything starts in the program, and then it reads from startup.cs, and I have a Swagger. I'll show you this one, actually run the application a little bit here. I have a Swagger page, and then here's my controller. So it's just a RESTful application. We have 2 endpoints we're producing. One to simply get all the widgets, return an IEnumerable collection of widgets, and then one that simply adds a new widget to the back end. So if I want to run this application, I just open up the terminal here, cdxyz, and then just do .NET run. And what that's going to do is launch the local server, and that was so fast, very, very quick. I do Java a lot, and the Java applications are starting to get a little sluggish, particularly unit testing. And you're going to hear me say praise about. I'm not just saying that because I'm at Microsoft. I'm saying that because like the unit test for the one project, Java project, takes 7-8 minutes to run, and yeah, there's a lot of them too, and tons of unit tests. And then so you push a build, have Jenkins kick off the build, and then you cross your fingers, hope nothing goes wrong. The recent app I did, that .NET Core app, has 60 tests in the test suite, and those unit tests go in 4 seconds. I'm not kidding. It's incredible how fast .NET Core is. And I really like this framework a lot. Okay, so I have this up and running. So you can see, I'll show you what the Swagger looks like. Localhost 8080. And for anybody who's never done back-end development, you can integrate something into your application called Swagger. What Swagger is, it's a standardized way of documenting your endpoints for the front-end development team. So assume XYZ Corporation has front-end developers, they have iOS developers, they have React developers. They all are going to be using this endpoint, making HTTP requests for the back-end data. So I have two endpoints here. I'll show you. API widget get, which simply returns a list of widgets, and then API widget add, if you want to add a new widget to the endpoint. So to try these things out, I can try it out here, and you can see, and let's see if it, oh, crud. I got the dreaded 500 internal server error. So we'll look at this code and see exactly what happened here. So let me stop my server real quick, and let me first show you the NuGet packages I have in this project, just so you guys can see it. Yeah, I threw a working collection. I wanted to make this on 2.1. I couldn't get. I just ran out of time. I may work on 2. Don't worry about Hangfire. That dependency shouldn't be in there. I don't know why that got in there. There's .NET Core. So I'm running 2.0.3 .NET Core, and I have hosting. I have all that stuff. I have mock. So I have a NuGet package called mock. I'm going to be showing you this tonight. It's for mocking objects on the back end. It's really, really cool. Does anybody use Serilog? Yeah, Serilog is wonderful for logging. I love Serilog. I'm going to show you a framework tonight called ORM Lite. And ORM Lite has a way for easily integrating with SQLite databases. I'll show you that, and then I'll show you a different way for doing that. The Swagger stuff. So that Swagger thing I showed you, the package that .NET uses is called Swashbuckle. And I think that's pretty much like the only package I know in NuGet that lets you do Swagger. Ironically, it's Talk Like a Pirate Day, so I get to mention Swashbuckle as well. The SQLite package I use is SQLite PCO. That's old school, but it works. It's pretty good. The XUnit runners, and there's Dapper as well, too. So I'm going to be showing you Dapper in a little bit. Dapper's really cool. Okay, so when we started here, we had some issues with our endpoints. When I tested it in Swagger, it returned a 500 internal server error. So if so all the code I'm writing, I use Rider for the most part. That's my main IDE I use if I'm doing .NET. I either switch back and forth between IntelliJ or Rider or WebStorm or DataGrip. Those are the big 4 I use. They're all JetBrains products. Okay, I got to drill into the service layer. So my controller, I'm injecting an interface called iService or iWidget service. I drill into this service method here called getWidget. So this is, yeah, a little bit bigger.
That's probably, is that too big?
Too big? All right. Yeah, here's my service layer. So I'll show you the code that's really brief. Here's the service layer. This is where your business logic is going to be, any validation if you want transactions. I'll drill into this. So here's getWidgets. Okay, so what getWidgets is, here's the widget service. I'm injecting a widget repository. So again, this is giving me my data access layer. And how am I going to implement the data access layer? We'll find out in a minute. So I drill into here, and okay, here's my widget repository. I drill into the implementation. Oh, crud. So why did my code return a 500 internal server error? Yeah, because we gotta actually write the code. So I intentionally left this way because I want to show you guys Dapper and how it compares to like other other ORMs that you probably use, like Microsoft Entity Framework as well. So a lot of people I know use Entity Framework, but this is Dapper. So Dapper is really, really nice. So I'm gonna get rid of this system.not-implemented exception. We're gonna write some code. Okay, get widgets. We need to basically query the database for all the widgets and then return a collection of this thing called widget. So what is my widget? All it is a plain old C# object, a POCO. And I have the one annotation there, that key annotation from system.data to basically tell me that, okay, that's a primary key. Widget ID is the primary key. So I need to return a list of widgets back to the table. How do I do this? I simply say using, then we do var SQL connection equals, and then connection factory dot get connection. I'll show you what this connection factory is in a little bit here. Okay, next thing you need to do is open the connection. Open the connection, very cool. And then the last thing I need to do is I need to get the list of widgets from the database. So you can see the type it returns is it's an asynchronous function, so I need to use await here, await, and then I'm gonna do is return await. And then to query the data, it looks like this, SQL connection dot query async. And it's obviously typed, so it's gonna return a type of widget. And then what my statement's going to look like is the following. So here, what I'm going to be doing for these examples is I'm going to be pushing for ANSI standard SQL tonight. You'll see why I want to do ANSI standard SQL. So I want my SQL to run not only on SQL Server, but also on this SQLite database I'm going to be showing you in a few minutes here. Okay, so querying all the data from the table, it looks like this. Select. I could do select star. I'm scared now because I got yelled at from the DBA for doing that, so I'm not going to ever do that anymore. I don't know why they hate select star, but why is that? Yeah. Yeah, I figured the locking was the big reason as well. And I'm trying to get out of that habit myself. Like on the Java side, like I'm using Anti-Framework JPA, and all the queries they auto-generate, they basically project all the columns in the generated SQL. So with Dapper, you have to write the SQL yourself, and as he said, it's best practice. Don't use select star. And the other trick you can do for getting the column names is in SQL Server. This is something I learned. If you drill into that database, like if you find your database here in SQL Server Management Studio, you see where it says columns under your table? You can just copy that. Like if you do Control-C, and then if you open up like Notepad and then paste it right there, there's your columns. SQL Server Management Studio lets you do that. That saved my that made my life really easy when.
Mike, could you do that again in slow motion?
All right, so getting this out. If you go back into Management Studio here and pick your table, and so here's my table in that database, and then you see where it says columns. Yes. Control-C for copy.
No way.
Yes. And then
With all I paid. What happens if you do the same thing with store proc?
I haven't tried that yet. I don't have any store procs in this database.
Excellent question.
Yeah, so. Yeah, that saved me. I have tables at my place that have like 60, 70 columns, and from converting those from select star, this really made my life a lot easier. And the DBA can sleep easy and stuff like that as well too. Okay, so back here, now I have those columns in my buffer. I can just paste them in right there. Really cool. Select widget ID, widget name from widget. So there is my query for getting all the widgets from the database. Look pretty straightforward. The next one here, add widget. Okay, what this query is going to do is insert a new record into the database. And again, I'm going to use ANSI standard SQL for this one. What my statement's going to look like is this: using var SQL connection equals connection factory. Connection factory dot get connection, and I'm going to do a SQL connection dot open because the using will close it. And I'm going to do is await SQL connection dot execute async. And what execute async does is it takes in a SQL statement. It looks like this: insert into widget. The column is going to be widget name, values. Thanks. Values, and then it's going to be something like this: widget name. And there's my SQL statement for that. Oh, and I should probably put these in parentheses because I definitely need them. What is the second argument going to be? It's simply a new object, which takes in widget name equals widget name. And then I hit semicolon right there. So that's what my insert statement looks like. Again, ANSI standard. If you worked with any framework, any framework does a lot of this stuff behind the back. You can use lambdas and stuff like that, make your life really easy. Now when you're using Dapper, you have to write SQL, and I think that's a good thing, in my opinion. And Dapper will automatically deserialize that for you into an object, which really, really cool. So let's see this code in action now. So I got rid of this 500. Let's restart the application. Somebody on Steam. Okay, back to our Swagger. I reload the Swagger, and if I go to API get, and if I do try it out, and if I execute, hey, there's our data. Really cool. And then if I go here to add a new widget, we'll hit try it out. I'm going to add a new widget. I'll call this guy production. Hell Homer. Hit execute. It's okay. We're good to go. And then if I reload this query up here, hit execute again, you see there is Hell Homer. And he has widget ID 5. So the API works. It works pretty well. The only caveat, the only thing wrong with this is it's not tested. And we're going to fix that. That's what we're here for. So one more thing I'll show you is that utility. I made a wrapper around IDB connection from SQL data for my connection factory. And you're going to be seeing me use this in my unit test when I actually pass in a SQLite connection string instead of a SQL Server connection string. My SQL Server connection string is in my app settings.properties as well. So questions so far? So cool. If you got anything out tonight, at least you got the SQL Management Studio trick. I thought that was pretty cool. All right, let's get back to the slide deck here. So back from this current slide. So again, we're working at Widget Corporation, and we want to integrate the unit test into that API. We fixed the API. There's no more internal server errors that we just had a few minutes ago. Okay, now we need to pick a unit testing framework for our application. So we have a number of options available for writing unit tests with .NET Core. NUnit, I'll talk about that in a minute. MS Build, which I've never used MS Build. I don't use it. I'm sure people still use it. The one I like is XUnit, and I'll talk about those as well. So personal preference I'm using is XUnit. I think the original guy who made NUnit also helped contribute to XUnit. I believe some of the team from JUnit also helped. So a lot of brains made this really nice framework. And coming from me working in Java, XUnit is very similar to JUnit. It's a really nice testing framework. But if you want to use NUnit, or if you maintain NUnit code, that's what unit test looks like. You annotate the entire class with that test fixture, and then each method in your unit test, you put the test annotation, and then instantiate calculator. You can see right there, 2 plus 2 should equal 4. And if it does equal 4, the test will be green and good. If it doesn't equal 4, the test will be bad. And we'll talk about bad unit tests in a little bit here tonight. But let's integrate XUnit into our code. So before we do this, we need to pick an in-memory database. And based on the topic, it's obviously SQLite, as you imagined. And so SQLite, and I still spelled it wrong in there. But let's actually demo SQLite. Okay. Oh, I spelled it right?
I was joking.
That's what I thought. Now it's in my head. Okay, so your people are wondering, do I use Visual Studio at all? Yeah, I teach at Penn State, and I teach C++. And so I am using Visual Studio for that course, and it's really nice. But I'm moving more to this JetBrains stuff because they pay me a lot of money to say good things about their products. But if you have a .NET Core application, so I'm sure a lot of people have .NET Core applications, and you might only have like one project in that solution, like an actual console application. All I really did was, I wanted this tonight, I did it ahead of time to save time, make sure that the scaffolding works. So if I go right here, say add a new project, if you go under, not C++, go to C#, go under .NET Core, you'll see you have the number of templates here. There's MS test template, and then there's this guy right here called XUnit test project. So all I did was I added an XUnit test project to the solution, and there used to be NUnit on here. As of like a couple months ago there was, and I guess Microsoft recently got rid of that template, which is kind of interesting. So that's no longer on Visual Studio. And then, back to Visual Studio. Then the other thing I need to do is that unit testing project, if you go under the dependencies, you'll see that I have it dependent on the actual core code. So the core application is going to be a dependency on my unit test. So let's actually start writing some cool unit tests here. Okay, so how do you write, what's an NUnit or what's an XUnit unit test look like? So let me show you. I'm going to add a new C# class, and I'll call this guy my awesome unit test. Cool. So here we're going to make a cool unit test in C#. So for making a X unit test, we're going to just make a method right here, public. We'll say it's void, and then I'll just say test my method. Okay. And then this is going to be our unit test. So every unit test you make in C#, you have to annotate it with this fact. So you need that fact annotation, and then what the test runner will do is, okay, they'll know this is a unit test, and I can run it. So running your unit test looks like this. I can just say var x equals 5, then I can do x++. So after I execute that, what, x is 6? So we can verify that it is 6. I can say assert.equal, and what it is it takes the expected result, which is 6, and the actual, which is going to be x. And let's actually test this out and see if the unit test actually runs. So if I go right here and I say run, and it's pending, hey, it's good. So the unit test passed. That's really good. But if you want to break the build, you can just go like that. You can obviously see it's expecting 7. Our code produces 6. If I run this test again, oh, and you can see right there, it's expected 7, but the actual is 6. Okay, that's how you write a X unit test. I'm not going to obviously put this in the project. I just wanted to show you how this thing works. I'll delete that guy. We don't need it. I just wanted to show you what that is. So unit tests are generally automated, and they're part of like your build pipeline. I use Jenkins for a lot of builds. You mentioned Azure now has build pipeline stuff, which I'm really intrigued about. I use GitLab. I have a GitLab server at the house. I know they're starting to do continuous integration. I like Jenkins. I think Jenkins is pretty cool. But so if it's running your builds, usually like you have the application build like every so often, like every 4 hours. If the unit tests fail, like if one of those 50 or 60 tests fail, everybody on the team will get an email. So somebody who checked in bad code, you'll then get the person's email who checked in that bad code, and then you can go point fingers at them and tell them to fix the build and stuff like that. So let's actually test our application. So we're going to need a couple things to make this application work. And the first thing I want to do is just go in here and make a directory. I'm going to call this guy utility. Okay, so we need a couple things here. One is I need the connection string for SQLite. And for doing that, I'm going to make a C# class called in-memory database. In-memory database. And I have this in a little text buffer on my notepad here, and I'm just going to copy paste and I'll talk about what this code. I don't want to write all this code just to save some time because I only have an hour to go here. We'll paste that in right there, import all the stuff that's missing, and I'll show you what in-memory database looks like. So all it really is, you can see that's what it is. I'm using a framework called ORM Lite. Has anybody used ORM Lite for Android or anything like that, for SQLite stuff? It's a pretty cool framework for doing, it's a pretty cool ORM for doing SQLite. There is a big caveat with it. It can be a very expensive caveat, as I found out. I'll talk about how we remedy that, like a $299 caveat. And like, I love my unit tests. I'm not going to spend $300 on my unit tests. I'll talk about the issue of that in a little bit here. But the cool thing I have here, okay, I have a method called open connection. So this is going to connect to the in-memory database, and then it's going to open the connection. And then I can use that connection in my repositories for then actually doing my data access. So instead of querying on SQL Server, now I'm going to be querying against a SQLite database. Okay, this guy right here. What ORM Lite's pretty cool is you give it an actual instance of your class. You saw that widget class I made. If you pass it to this method called insert, what SQLite will do, or ORM Lite will do, is it will automatically create the schema for you if it doesn't exist. So, but this has a caveat. There is a 10-table limit. And I found out the hard way about that. I ran my build. I'm like, why is this test failing? And I go in there, and I want to see the build fail for reasons that I caused. I don't want to see the build fail because I exceeded my quota on the number of tables I can instantiate. So, and I've tried everything to get around that limit. I looked at their code. It's a static variable. There's nothing I can do, pretty much. So be very, I'll show you two different ways of getting around this one. Okay, so here's my in-memory database class. The next class I'm going to make, I'm sure a lot of people here use app settings.json in your. I'm going to make a little configuration fixture. Okay, make a configuration fixture. configuration fixture. And again, I have this code right here. All this does is it basically lets me use appsettings.json. It uses that configuration root and stuff like that. So it's just a way how I can use my app settings configuration properties in my unit test as well, if I want that. Okay, so what are we going to unit test? So I showed you this repository with those two queries, the one that does a select star and the other one that has the enter statement. Let's put that actual class under test. So I'm going to go up here. I'm going to make another directory. And I think, what did I call it in my base project? I called it repository. I'm gonna do the same thing here. Make a directory called repository. I'm gonna add a couple things. I'm gonna add another directory first. So if you have many different repositories in your application, you might want to have like a same base class that they all inherit from. So I'm gonna make a base repository test class. And you'll see what this is gonna look like in a few minutes. Base repository test. I spell it right? Yeah, I think I did. Okay, and what my base repository test is going to look like is the following. So I'm going to use that configuration fixture. Oh dear, let me rename that. Base. Let's add the class and try that again. Base repository test. Okay, here's my base repository class. I don't want people instantiating this, so I'm going to make this thing abstract. So all I'm going to have in this is a protected property, protected read-only configuration fixture that I made, and I'll call that guy configuration. And then what I can do is make that thing injected from the constructor. So that is all I'm going to be doing in that case. That's what my base method looks like. Now let's actually test our repository. So I'm going to go back to my upper directory, and I'm going to cancel that real quick. I'm going to go to my upper directory, and I'm going to make another class called test, widget repository. So these are where my unit tests are going to be for this case. So what we're going to do is we're going to test that getWidgets method. Okay. So for making unit tests, a couple things. We need that fact annotation. For XUnit to work, you need that fact annotation. The next thing we're going to do is we want to test our widgets call. So I'm going to do a public. Since I'm using asynchronous methods, I'm going to say this is going to be async. And anytime you use asynchronous methods, you have to return something called a system threading task. And what can we name this guy? Let's just call it test get widgets, like that. And there's going to be our unit test for get widgets. One thing before I move on, so I went to a Java user group at I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm like 2 hours away from here. And I went to a Java user group, and the guy was in his 50s and 60s basically got on a soapbox and talked about why people should test and all that stuff. Here's a cool tip he told me. What he likes to do is, he likes to rename his test methods like this, test get underscore widgets. So he likes having his unit tests with the lowercase. And so you'll see a lot of code where people write their unit tests this way with the underscores between them. The reason he likes it this way is because, okay, 1 a.m. the build breaks. Somebody checked in some bad code, your build breaks. The next morning at your job, who are the first people to get into the office? Probably the managers. Developers don't start till like 9:30. Managers are there at 7:30 or so. They get their coffee. They see the email from Jenkins about the build breaking. And then when they have your unit tests written with the underscores between them, the manager is able to see, oh, you can go at your desk, point the finger, why did test underscore get widgets fail? And then you'll have to fix it. That's a little tip he told me as well. So I've gotten in the habit of writing my unit tests that way. It's up to you. Let's add some data too. So we're going to mock up some data. So how am I going to mock the data? Well, I'm going to make a variable called table equals new widget. And I'm going to set the widget ID equal 1. And I'm making mock data. Remember, I don't want to use production SQL Server database. I want to use this cool SQLite stuff. And you can see I'm a Java guy still. Widget name. What can we call this guy? We'll call it test Hellhomer. So testing Hellhomer. So I'm making a sample widget. Now we need a database connection. Okay. Var db equals new in memory. Whoops. In memory database. And I think that guy right there. Very good. Next thing we need to do is open the connection. db.open connection. Very cool. The next thing we need to do is we need to call that cool insert method. db insert. And what insert's going to take in is a new list of type widget. and what I'm going to pass in is something called table. Okay, and I need to import. I need to include list. It's enumerable. Import it. Very good. Okay, so now again, what that insert will do is that'll automatically create. It's using that ORM like framework. It'll automatically create the tables for you if they don't exist in the SQLite database. So if you're lazy like I am, that'll automatically do that work. But again, that has a 10 table limit. So you need to decide, is it worth the $299 to upgrade so you can have 11 or 12? I'll show you a workaround for that in a little bit here. Okay, now let's actually write our test. So we can do our test here. Okay, so we need a repository. Var repository. What we need to do is make a mock repository. Say create mock repository. Okay, and let's actually implement that right now. So we'll make it private in the unit test itself, just for the demo purposes. This guy needs to return iWidget repository. And what this also needs to take in is an instance of in-memory database. We'll call that guy DB. Okay, so making the repository looks like this: var widget db mock equals new mock. So I'm using that framework called mock, which is in MOQ. That's the NuGet package. And what I want to mock is I want to mock iDatabase connection factory. iDatabase connection factory, that little wrapper I made and I showed you a little while ago. Okay, then do the following. It's widgetdbmocks.setup, and it takes in a lambda, so let's say C, and then that points to c.getConnection. And then what this does is it returns db.openConnection. And I need the parentheses around that. So there's that. And now I need to get so now I have the database connection. I can instantiate the repository. What I'm going to do is simply return a new widget repository. And this guy takes in one argument, widgetdbmock.object. So everybody following along here. So back here, I should have passed in the DB up top. I forgot to do that. I'll do that right now. Pass in DB. So now we have a repository. We can actually test our calls as well. So let's test that call. So I'm going to make a var result equals repository dot get widgets. Okay, so how many widgets are in my collection? I'm sorry. Yes. Don't need to do that. No, oh yeah, I did that because the ORM light thing. Yeah, I guess I am doing it twice. If anybody wants to fix this on the code will work. If anybody wants to fix it on my GitHub, go ahead, submit a pull request. I'll merge it when I get home then. Yeah, I am doing it twice. The reason is that guy right there, because I'm having it insert and then create the tables. I really don't need to be doing that, but I wanted to use it. I wanted to use a mock. Yeah, that's a mistake on my end. I should fix that. Back here then, so a result, and then the other thing we need to, okay, there's one test result. What I can do is do an assert. So if you're expecting one result, you can do assert single, and single takes in, well, it just simply takes in a result. And pretty nifty. Well, one more thing to do. Oh wait, there we go. And that's our unit test. One more thing I need to do is I got to add a few things up top here. I need to make this guy come from base repository test, and I also need to make this thing implement iClass fixture of type configuration fixture. And to make this work, I need to then have a constructor, generate constructor, and there's the constructor. So that's all I really needed as well. Okay, let's test this unit test out. So what we're doing is we're making one record in that table, their SQLite database, and then we're making the assumption that the repository is going to return one record from that database. So if I go here, run this unit test, it's pending, success. Cool. So that's pretty cool, because if you look right here, here's the production database. We have 5 records in our production database. Our SQLite database only has 1 record. And so we have 2 isolated databases, which I really like. And that's how I do it in Java. And I figured out how to make it work in .NET. We can do it over here as well. So if I make another table, so I'll make another one of these. I'll call this table 2. I'll give this table ID 2. And I'll call this guy test telehomer the second. And if I want to add that to my collection here, we'll say table 2. Got it. Now if I run this code, I should be expecting 2 results. Let's find out if this works. It's pending. Blah. It failed. Okay, so how can we fix that? Well, we should have 2 results. Instead of me saying assert single, what I'm going to do is do an assert equal. The expected is 2, and the result dot count is going to be what I'm looking against here. So now if I run that unit test one more time, success. Really, really cool. Yes.
Hey, Mike. So we had a question online from Mixer. For this unit test framework, if you have a constructor in the test class, does it trigger per unit test or only once for the test run?
If you have a constructor in the unit test, so yeah, that's a very good question. So oops, don't want to see that. This guy right here. So I have and again, you don't want to see that. Each individual unit test is in its isolated block. And so I'm working with isolated instances of my SQLite database. So one mock data is going to be different than another unit test mock data. It's this guy right here, where I do this new in-memory database. That basically means that any data I make in this method is going to be scoped in this particular, just for that particular unit test. So did that answer the question for the person on Mixer? That's an issue I have in Java as well, too. And I think that's the reason why the Java unit test runs so slow, is ideally you want every unit test you have be isolated. So all the data is isolated. So if you mock data, you don't want to be able to share data between your unit tests. And so Spring has something called, it's like Dirty's context. And that really bumps up the runtime on these unit tests. With .NET Core, now that I have the unit test inside each, my in-memory database inside each unit test, I don't have to worry about everything being very isolated. And as you're going to see in a little bit, these .NET tests are very, very fast. Like running the command for doing tests is very, very quick. Okay, so I have one more demo I want to show you, and then we'll get back to the remainder of the slide deck here. Okay, so this is the only caveat we have is this guy right here. So I was showing you about this DB insert that's using that ORM late database stuff. And a case study for me, I wrote an application at work, had 60 some unit tests in there, and then I was doing .NET test, .NET test, .NET test, and then all of a sudden the whole build broke. I'm like, wow, what's going on? So behind the scenes, if you look at the code behind the scenes here, in this DB insert, this guy right here, DB create table if not exists. I think they have it, yeah, whatever. I think they actually have the warning in this code somewhere. Do they have it? I don't know, but there's an actual warning in there. So if you're calling that method for 10 different classes, that's your limit. That's your threshold. And if you go above that, you have to pay for a commercial license of ORM Lite. And you have to come to that decision. Is it worth the $300? Up to you. For me, I said, no, it's not. So how I got around this issue was the following here. I have a SQL Management Studio extension called SQLite SQL Server Compact Toolbox. I'll show you where that is. It's on GitHub. I have the link for this on GitHub. What this will do is it will take a SQL Server database and it will give you a SQLite script for you. It'll give you well, let me actually show you how this works here. So here's my database right there. I can then right-click and then do script database. And they give you a number of options here. You have, let me just try that again. So you can either script the schema, the data, the schema, or SQLite. So this is the guy I want right here, that script schema for SQLite. Okay, so I'm going to go right here, script the database for SQLite, and I'm going to take the DB widget, and I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to save this on my desktop as XYZ widget.sql, and hit OK. So cool. What it did was it took my SQL Server database, pardon Spider-Man there, and it made a really nifty SQLite create statement. So it did the heavy lifting that ORM Lite tool did. Now I have this toolbox in Management Studio. I can have this script my database for me and then use this in my unit test, and I can get around that 10 table threat. That's how I got around that 10 table threshold in code. So all we need to do is then take this SQL file, find a way to load it in our unit tests, and we should be good to go. And yeah, let me show you what we're going to do here. So I'm going to take that SQL script I have, XYZ widget. Let me go back to Writer. I'm going to go to my Solution Explorer. I'm going to make a directory here. So we're going to make a couple directories. First directory, oh, come on. This slope of my mouse here. Add new directory. I'm going to call this guy SQLite. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is make another directory. I'm just going to call it schema. And I'm going to right click here. I'm going to open this guy in my Windows Explorer. And what I'm going to do is then drag this guy in there. So you can see I have that SQLite schema now part of my test project. And what I'm going to be doing in my unit tests is basically finding a way to open it and then execute this into that SQLite database, and then my schema is there, and it's good to go. So if you're wondering on like big databases, the database I have on the project I built has like 17 or 18 tables with foreign keys, all sorts of stuff. It works like a charm. This trick works very well. Okay, so let's put this all together. And we're up. Okay, so we need to find a way to integrate this into the back end somehow. So that's SQLite.
That script, you can also open data.
Yeah, you can have it. So I'll show you that again. Yeah, when I right-clicked on the database, it said script database, script schema. Yeah, or you can also do data as well too.
Okay.
It's. I'll show you. I have the link in my slide. I'll give you that as well too. Let me go right here. I'm going to go back to my base repository test. So to integrate that in, I'm going to do a little copy paste because we're running a little bit out of time here. Here's what my new base repository looks like. I'm going to take that guy, and I'm just going to go like that. And call it the base repository test. That's the only mistake I made. I need to integrate a few things here. I import the missing references. Cool. Okay, so you can see right there, I did these right schema. Oops, oh, I spelled these wrong. It should be, how did I spell it? SQLite. And then I called this guy schema. And I think I called it XYZ widget.sql. Yeah, cool. All right. That's good. And okay, so what I did was I made a method here called create widget repository, which cut that out. It basically does that in-memory database thing, but then it'll then read that schema file, and then it'll invoke a repository method that actually runs that against the database. So we need to actually make this method in our repository. Hey, this is, by the way, called test-driven development, where you actually write your unit test before writing the actual application code. So let's make a method called create SQLite schema. This is going to take a task called the script. Very cool. And then if I drill down into my actual concrete repository, implement that missing guy right here. We can see one last go around with Dapper, make it async. Okay, here we go, using var SQL connection equals connection factory.get connection, and then I'm going to do a SQL connection dot open, and then I'm going to do the following await SQL connection dot execute async, and I'm going to give that guy my script. So what that's going to do is it's going to run that generated SQLite script against my database. I'm kind of making this method in my repository only for the unit tests, but I think that's a pretty cool pattern. So back here, now we have one more unit test to write. So I'm going to rename this unit test. So instead of calling it test get widgets, I'll call this guy test get widgets ORM lite. And we'll make one more unit test. So I'm going to make another method here. I should just do it myself. Public void, public async void, task. Sorry. What can we call this guy? Test get widgets SQLite or something like that. And let's put the annotation here called fact. Okay. So now we are going to use that base repository that's going to generate it from our schema. So we don't have to worry about the schema. It's going to automatically be there for it. So it looks like this. So var repository equals await create mock repository. Is that what I called it? No, not create mock repository. The one of my base class is called create widget repository. Cool. The next thing we're going to do is now we have the repository, we can then mock data. Okay, so if I do, how can I add records into the database? Well, I have another repository called add widget And I can use that for this particular case. Await, repository, add widget, and let's mock some data here. Philly
Special is the second one.
Special. I was going to say Philly.net, but now we need a third something. Philly Special. Homer? Philly Special Homer. All right. There's that. So we marked some data, and now let's validate the results here. Validate these guys. So I'm going to do a var result equals await repository.get widgets. How many widgets do we have? We obviously have 3 in this unit test. I'm going to do assert.equal. The expected is 3. The result.count is going to be 3 as well. Now if I run this particular unit test, works like a charm. And so the other question that somebody asked on the Mixer stream was, okay, are these 2 unit tests isolated from each other? So you see one's making its own set of data for testing, the other unit test is making its own set of data for testing. So the cool way, how you can run unit tests all at once, if I go to my command prompt here, and I just open up a terminal, put that down there, cd xyz test, and then the command for running all your tests on your project is simply .NET test. .NET test. And watch how fast these guys. That's my thing. It's the rider thing. But you can see the green. Green's good. But let's see if we can break the build here. So let's actually have a real build breaking thing. Change this from 3 to 4. Save. And you'll see that, oh, the build failed. And then all the emails go out, and then managers are unhappy the next morning when they have their coffee. But since I'm going to check this in for everybody in GitHub, I'll do it right now. We'll make that 3. I don't want to check in broke code to the repo. .NET test. Cool. And let's actually push all this code. So I'm going to right-click here and put this code up on GitHub like right now, so you guys have this.
Before you do that,
yes.
Add a comment above the line you're at.
Okay.
And that says change the number to a different value to fail the test.
Is that good?
Yeah.
All right. Cool. So I'm gonna push this into my. I'll commit this to GitHub right now. What can we call this guy? Feature complete. Hit commit here. Hit commit and push. Hit push. And everything should be up on GitHub. So if you clone that repository, it's all yours to play with. Yeah, so let me wrap up the slide deck. I have like a couple more slides I want to talk about here. One is like an actual test case where unit testing saved my butt for one case as well. So from current slide. So a thing called best practices. Last slide set I put together. I'm sure a lot of people heard of this book, heard of this guy, Bob Martin. He's the unit testing god, if you want to call him that, in the land of unit testing.
He actually spoke at Philly.net a couple years ago. Yeah,
that's awesome.
He was here.
He put out another book, I believe last September as well, too, part of his Bob Martin series. He pushes a paradigm called test-driven development. Test-driven development is a paradigm where the unit tests are actually, believe it or not, you actually write the unit test before you actually write the application code. And you're probably thinking, wow, that's crazy talk. That's actually pretty cool because I think the unit test should dictate the requirements of how the back end of your application should be written. And as I just showed you, .NET Core makes it so easy to do this. And it's pretty cool. But for some applications where there's literally no tests and thousands and millions of lines of code, that might be utopia, unfortunately. But so let's say you have a application that doesn't have any tests, no unit tests. What's the first thing I would do? I'd run something called a coverage report. And that's going to be the last demo I show you tonight. It's the code coverage report. The next thing you'll do, make your unit tests quick. Make them things fast so developers constantly get in the habit of running .NET test, .NET test, .NET test before they push their code. So you want your unit tests to be very fast. You saw .NET Core, they are very fast. And if I upgrade this application to 2.1, I bet they'd be even faster. So if anybody wants to, over the weekend, upgrade my app I just wrote from .NET Core 2.0 to 2.1, go ahead, and I'll definitely merge your fixes into the branch. So if you're in the real world, if you're on a sprint and a tester gives you a JIRA ticket, okay, you have to make a bug fix, this is a good time to write a unit test. If you have an application with no unit tests and a tester gives you a JIRA ticket, okay, fix this, that's when you should start writing unit tests, in my opinion. So let me show you my last demo night on code coverage here. So for code coverage is a way of showing you what % of your code is actually tested. And the reason I like Java and Spring, the Spring framework is 100% code coverage, which I'm pretty cool. So any .NET Core people I hope the number is just as high. I don't know the code coverage on .NET Core. I'm hoping with Microsoft doing it's very high as well too. So I know that the frameworks I'm using are tested. That's my goal here. But so for finding unit tests, I have this test fixture right here. To make this thing, so for running a code coverage report, if you go right here, I'm showing you in Rider. I don't know how you do this in Visual Studio. It says cover all. So there's an option called cover all. And what this will do is it'll generate a code coverage report. You can see on the right-hand side there, as it runs my unit test, it'll show you what % of the code is test covered, has test cases. And we did better than some people. We have 49% code coverage. It's not bad. I mean, it's better than like 15% code coverage. The unit test package obviously has a very high test rate because that's good. Where could we improve on our code coverage? So yeah, the repositories are 100% code coverage, and the models are pretty good. We should write some unit tests for our service layer, and probably write some unit tests for the controllers as well too. On Java, like if I'm testing a RESTful API, I have something called mockita where I can actually mock an HTTP request and then mock the response and then compare the result codes, stuff like that. The example I showed you was Swagger. In a real world, like those API calls, they're going to be locked down by like a JWT, like a Java JSON Web Token. And so how do you test your code that you write? The only way, in my opinion, is by using unit tests. It's infeasible to basically launch the application, generate a JWT, and then test it that way. It's much easier just to have the unit test do all the work for you. That's my spiel, but that's code coverage. I think Visual Studio has this. You can generate reports, give them to your manager, all type of stuff like that. But back to the current slide here. So here's the thing that really saved me. I have another application I'm working on with some friends. We integrate with a third-party API. This is where unit tests are downright awesome. We integrate, so believe it or not, Walmart, they have an API where you give it a UPC, or like a barcode. And what they'll do is they'll give you a JSON result set back. So you can see I have some code there. I'm querying the Walmart API with that API. I'm with that UPC code. I'm expecting the product to be Super Mario Odyssey for Nintendo. It's a Nintendo Switch game if anybody plays that and stuff. So if I have this thing run nightly, let's say the Walmart employee, they update the product name from Super Mario Switch to like Super Mario, some other product name. That's gonna break my build. That's what I want though, because I can go in there and then research. Okay, why'd the build break? Oh, it's because the Walmart employee made a mistake. I'll just fix this. The build is good. Here, what about if Walmart revokes your API key? How would you know this stuff? If you have a third party like Amazon or Walmart that revokes your API key, if this thing runs at night, you'll know right away that your API key is gone. How would you know otherwise that you don't? You just write and forget about it. So this is where unit testing really helps me out. But here's the references, the surveys I have right there. And if you want that little SQLite tool for SQL Management Studio, that is there as well. I'll put these slides up. I'll put the slides up on SlideShare. I'm on Twitter. I'm Mr. JavaScript. I'll put up on GitHub all the codes up there in SlideShare as well too. So.
That was a lot to take in 1 hour. This is what happens when they allow overclocking of developers. Could you go that fast? Good job, Mike. So I think, how many think this would make a good session at CodeCamp? Yeah. Just saying. Okay. Maybe but these people wouldn't come again, but they'll bring their friends will come.
Might submit.
Something to think about. But that was very informative. All right. So that was good. And the next speaker, we'll give him at least a minute and a half to. You're going to need your microphone, sir. Yeah, he's got to plug in a lot of stuff. So while John is doing that, any questions, comments? Did we have enough food tonight?
I think the
didn't go out and
microphone
look.
into. Oh, cool.
Okay. So the one thing that Mike talked about is the speed of unit tests. So one of the things you should consider, Microsoft just made this big announcement about devops.azure.com. If you were to move, that's not only for storing your source code. So basically it's sort of replaces TFS in the cloud. You can store your source code there, but what they do is they give you machines, virtual machines, to actually run your unit test and do your builds. And I think a lot of the DevOpsAzure.com goes exactly to what Mike showed you. The whole idea is to make all that stuff so fast that you don't have any excuses not to do testing. So it's something you really should look at when you have a chance. Has anybody looked at that yet? Or because they just announced it and we all have work to do and families and stuff like that. Okay. You'll get to it. He needs one more minute. Come on, somebody. Mr. Gomez, how many people have we had online tonight?
20 the whole time.
That's pretty good. So since we've been doing this close to a year, we actually get less people attending the meetings. We love you guys. They actually show up and we can talk to a real person. But we've been increasingly getting more people online for every meeting. And even though there's only maybe 15 or 20 online right now, I guarantee there'll be 50 to 100 that actually watch this over the next couple weeks. Whoa. So that's the lab. I did the intro to that and Chris did the hands-on. 450 people have watched that. Okay. Our plan right now is we're going to probably be recording in 2 rooms all during CodeCamp. So even though you guys are going to put down your hard-earned cash to come to CodeCamp, a lot of the better sessions will actually be broadcast for free afterwards. So that's another way we contribute to the community. And Chris will do a talk on how to record your sessions. And during the talk, he's going to be recording a session on how to. It's a recursive. All right, come on. Somebody asked me a question. Are you almost ready? Sir?
I'm ready to go.
He is ready.
You
okay.
can hear me.
So, all the way from the foreign country called Missouri,
St. Louis, Missouri. Yeah.
John Beluca is going to talk about how he uses open source.
Thanks. All right, so we got a lot of content in that first talk, and you're going to get a lot more content thrown at you. So it seems like every time I give this talk, no matter how fast or slow I give it, it's exactly 1 hour. So I'm always curious how long this takes. So Knob Commerce, how many have heard of Knob Commerce? Cool, there's a few hands. I usually see none. Knob Commerce is a .NET, ASP.NET MVC open source framework that's been around for almost 10 years. And the original title of the talk was Knob Commerce .NET Developer Overview. But when I gave this talk, I kept getting the response that, when it comes to open source, this talk is kind of a good example of why to get involved in open source. For someone that works the normal job, 9 to 5 or 9 to 9, whatever you're working nowadays. And that was kind of the big takeaway that was given this talk. Now, this is definitely a technical talk, but there are some aspects that kind of come out of this talk of what to look for in open source and how you can identify with possibly Knob Commerce or another open source solution that you can kind of use as a reference architecture for yourself and possibly get more involved with. So let's jump right into this. Oh, first off, I help coordinate speakers and sponsors at the St. Louis.NET meetup. If you're weird like me and you like to go in different cities and give talks, please reach out to me. We also put you up in a hotel, Bearstar Casino. I got a buddy there. And we can put you up in St. Louis. We come out. All right, so for tonight, we're just going to jump right into open source. I'm going to cover or briefly mention a couple other packages that are out there, and then we'll cover what NOP Commerce is. Now, when I was looking for a enterprise level solution like NOP Commerce, I wasn't really looking for an e-commerce solution. I was just looking for something that I could actually create training on. I wanted something that had a really good architecture to it and was kind of in that Microsoft stack realm as well. As I mentioned, this is definitely a technical talk. We're going to walk from the front end all the way to the back end. We're going to look at the test coverage. There'll be some surprises there. It's good to get a lot of the testing aspects for this part of the talk. And we'll touch on extensibility just a little bit. This talk was a talk that I actually gave and really prepared for the NOP Commerce Conference last year in November. Now, I was not planning on giving this talk this year, but since giving the talk at the conference, that's where things kind of changed for me, even professionally. So this talk itself, I kind of changed up the summary to kind of reflect this past year and what NOP Commerce has kind of done for me in a way. And also I'll share where this presentation can be found. So we're going to just walk through the architecture, really just walk through the project. So 0 means you know .NET, you can read C#. I'm assuming I've got the right crowd for that. Then we're going to look at the storefront, nop.web, that project. There's a kind of a common UI architecture or project of web.framework. Then there's the nop.admin project for the admin interface for managing products and so on. Nop.core, that's your common library of a lot of reusable code. And then you also have NOP services. Now this project has pretty much all the business logic, or a good portion of it, but it's not a multi-tier architecture. This is just one install. It's not a microservice architecture or anything like that. It's a pretty simple architecture in that nature. Nop.data, that's the library where you're going to find different repositories that work with Entity Framework. And how many of you work with Entity Framework on a regular basis? So I will be curious if any of you have seen Entity Framework implemented this way. When we get an Entity Framework, when I saw this architecture, it was the first time of how I saw Entity Framework implemented this way. So I'll want to get some feedback on that part. Then we got the nop.test. We'll be looking closer at the coverage of that. And we'll briefly touch on plugins and what you can do there. So this architecture is, and this is why I chose it actually, it's a very typical architecture as a Microsoft developer. On the front end, there's RazorView and jQuery. Now, this might be an architecture, especially on the front end side, that you might have chosen 5 years ago. Because nowadays, the latest buzz is Angular, React, Vue, all of those. But nonetheless, it's a pretty, still pretty solid architecture, especially when it comes to being responsive. Then, of course, we have Entity Framework, SQL Server, and we'll be even looking at AutoFact as well a little closer. The Visual Studio Developer Essentials, I don't know how many are aware of this, but this is pretty cool if you're not aware of it. I don't work for Microsoft, but that might sound like I do on this part. So you get the Visual Studio Community Edition. By the way, the Community Edition is the professional edition, and you can release commercial apps on that. It's only if you're a multi-million-dollar organization that you can't use Community. So it's worth downloading Community, and you are getting Pro. You also get Azure credits, 25 per month. That's enough to get maybe started. You also get 5 users and unlimited private repositories for Visual Studio Team Services, which is now the Azure DevOps. So I know like GitHub, I think you still have to pay for private repositories. Here you get all the features of TFS and so on. You also get SQL Server Developer Edition, which is nice for development. And what I like the most is that you get a 3-month subscription to Pluralsight. And I kind of bring this up for a couple reasons. One of them is I watch it a lot. This is my way of dealing with my good old imposter syndrome and keeping up with things. About 2 years ago, I decided to watch a course a week. That is not easy to do. I would much rather be binge watching whatever on Netflix, and it takes a lot of discipline to do this. I'm probably maybe 120 some odd courses in, but so yes, it's not easy to do, but it's a really nice habit to have. the main reason I really bring this up is that throughout this talk and walking through this architecture, I really can't thoroughly explain MVC or entity framework, but I at least can kind of highlight different courses that you can check out further that do relate to this code base. So let's just jump right in open source. So GitHub is still kind of the go-to place. I think that's kind of a hands down, but there are other sources that you could look at as well to find that solution. When I was first looking at different open source projects, I was looking at more of the content marketing or CMS type systems. So you got .NET Nuke, Umbraco, Orchard. I was even curious about the humanitarian toolbox. Then I started looking at the different e-commerce solutions, such as NobCommerce and VertoCommerce and SmartStore.net. So the one aspect about GitHub is that this really needs to be hammered home if you're not aware of this already. This is really a library for you. Most of the time, GitHub is talked about in a passive way to where there's, the different libraries or frameworks and things like that are out there. But there are a lot of end-to-end solutions like NobCommerce that are out there that are awesome to look at for a reference architecture for maybe what you're doing at the day job. A lot of us look at or go to the Hello World examples first. I recommend going to a fully baked implementation of Entity Framework or whatever that technology stack that you're looking at, Dapper. I'm sure there's one out there for that because that is a popular library. So heavily explore GitHub and what's out there at a solution level and try to find something that kind of interests you for your career. So .NET Nuke, that was probably one of the first .NET-based open source solutions I became aware of. There was VB.NET. They converted everything over to C#. They're still going pretty strong. Then you have Umbraco. They have a pretty strong community around them to where there's a marketplace. They have their own developers conference, things like that. So when it comes to a content management system that we're checking out, Orchard is another CMS to look at. The reason I bring up this one, they're a little bit more bleeding edge for the technology stack that they apply. I think they already have a .NET Core version released. I'm not really sure of that, but typically they're trying to apply the latest technologies that Microsoft is putting out there. Humanitarian Toolbox is a good one to check out if you're looking at open source to kind of get more involved. The guys at .NET Rocks promote this a lot, so you might have heard of it already. Then I started to look at the different e-commerce solutions. So NobCommerce stood out right away, but I wasn't kind of just sold just yet. I felt like I needed to do a little bit more research before I just chose this solution. So I looked at VertoCommerce. Now this is a solution that might be even closer to an architecture that you do utilize at the day job. So like there's AngularJS is there, there's Bootstrap aspects, there's Elasticsearch for full text searching as part of this solution. So again, this one might be a little more applicable to what you are doing today. Then I came across SmartStore.net, and I really like what I saw in their demo app, and then I'm looking at it and I download the code, and I'm comparing the code, or I'm just looking at it, looked really familiar, then I pull up the NobCommerce code, and doing a little bit of research, I found that SmartStore.net basically copied NobCommerce and rebranded with their name. It's probably the worst possible thing you can do in the open source world, and that's what happened here. So that, by the way, that's Andre. He's the founder and organizer of NobCommerce since day one. And I really kind of blame him for me getting so involved in NobCommerce. So I'll share more of that story later, but it did work things out, but still I saw that craziness going on with that legal battle, and I started focusing on NobCommerce, and I really haven't looked back. So NobCommerce, and I've seen this with other solutions as well, you can just run the software. You don't have to download anything, then compile and run it. You can run the front end and the administrator just by going to their website to get a feel for how the application works. I think they refresh the database every 15 minutes, so you can create orders. You can just get a really good feel of how this solution works. So it is up on GitHub, and those of you who aren't familiar with GitHub, you can connect directly with a Git or even an SVN client. I don't know if you're aware of that. You don't have to use Git. You can actually use SVN against GitHub. You can just simply download all the source code as a zip file. Also on GitHub, you can easily just browse the code. So the barrier of entry on GitHub on really getting familiar with source code is pretty low. Not Commerce themselves, they were originally on Codeplex, which was Microsoft's open source repository. So they completely closed up that site, I think, about a year ago. NOP and many other solutions moved over to GitHub. So I want to kind of point that out because maybe the number of contributions and whatnot might be a little low because those numbers really didn't kick in until the last 2 years, even though they've been around for about 10 years. And it's definitely an active project. Built with, how many have heard of this one? This site. This is cool. You can put in a technology like NOP Commerce and you can kind of get a sense of demographically where it's used the most. It is used the most in the States. You can compare it against other e-commerce solutions like Magento, which is a really big solution in the PHP world. Gives you a lot of information. This is a free site. Even better, you can put whatever company site into that, and for what it can understand about what's behind the scenes of that company site, it can tell you whether they're using .NET or something that's Java-based, or it's pretty detailed and pretty impressive how much built with can crawl basically someone's site. That's worth checking out, especially if you're getting ready to interview for a company. Put in that company site name.com and see what they have behind the scenes. The web platform installer is really where I discovered NOP Commerce. I didn't go to GitHub or Codeplex first. I kind of discovered it here, and there are many other solutions, even in the web platform installer, that are most likely on GitHub as well. So the only thing I'm really trying to point out here is that GitHub is probably the most popular source by far, but there is the web platform installer to kind of give you more of a sense of all the different solutions that are out there, and most of which are open source. So the opportunities that are with NOP Commerce and really any open source software, typically as a developer, you're thinking about the marketplace where you're creating themes or plugins for that particular product, and that's where you can make a little money on the side. So that's probably the most popular aspect of getting involved in open source when it comes to NOP Commerce or any other package out there. There's also certification. You can specialize in NOP Commerce or in other solutions as well. Certification, I think you pay $100, take an exam, and then you're certified. So I haven't done that yet, but nonetheless, that's what NOP Commerce has to offer there. You can apply it to be a store owner, set up a dropshipping site. So you simply use the software. That's an opportunity. But really, and this last point really should be big and bold. The opportunity is absolutely for you. When it comes to having a reference architecture for your career, it's not like you have to stick with NOP and not look at anything else, but it's good to really dive deep into someone else's architecture, not just so much for yourself and learning, but when it comes to job interviews, I've been on both sides of the table quite a few times as the interviewee and the interviewer. And when I'm interviewing a candidate, typically they're talking about their current job or what they've done on the job. Sometimes they're divulging a few secrets that are kind of a little bit of a turnoff that they're so freely talking about things. But I can understand that as an interviewer, you have nothing else really to talk about except what you're doing at the day job. Or you have the candidate talk about what they're doing in their spare time on their own open source thing that they're working on, or their own code base that they're working on, or their own ORM that they're creating is a popular one, of course. And that comes across like a little bit of a turnoff because sometimes it comes across that the candidate is wanting to implement that at the day job. There's this third option of finding a solution like NOP Commerce or something else that gives you something to talk about objectively. I don't like everything in NOP Commerce, but I have a reference architecture to really communicate a basis of what I know about Entity Framework and ASP.NET, MVC, and so on. So I highly recommend for your career, find a reference architecture that you can kind of latch onto just as a reference point and build upon. All right, so what is NOP Commerce? I'm going to kind of go through this part pretty quickly, then we're going to jump right into looking at the architecture. So it is I would say your typical e-commerce solution. You got a shopping cart. There's a good administration to it for managing products and whatnot. It's extensible, so it's a very common feature set. When you first fire up the app, this is what you get out of the box if you have the sample data in it. And you'll also notice that on a mobile device, it's responsive, which is nice to see out of the box. Pretty much the whole UI on every page is responsive. And that's on the storefront as well as the administrator. Now, the administrator has a lot of things that it's managing. It's also responsive, which is cool to see. I don't think you're going to want to manage products on your mobile device, but nonetheless, it's nice to see that it can handle that. Now, when it comes to looking at a reference architecture, this is probably the kind of app that you're looking at or creating the most at the day job. There's a lot of good things to discover here of what you can do within the admin. All right, so back to the splash of technologies. When you just see things this way and walking through an architecture, it's kind of hard to understand where things fit. So it's good to put them in some kind of swim lanes when it comes to walking through the architecture. So we're going to walk through the application layer, the business layer, and the data access layer. And as we, so the projects themselves, I like that they are pretty clean. There's nothing too crazy going on here. And when it comes to plugins, some things they didn't really have to implement as a plugin, but I think they kind of did that as well just for having some examples for you to follow if you want to create your own. So it's nice that it does come with a good handful of plugins out of the box. So we'll just kind of keep these frameworks, libraries in mind as we walk through the architecture, but we'll be more focused on the projects themselves and the code that's within them. Oh yes, it's always good to point out that it's a very clean architecture, but not everything is perfect. So some people might not like the idea that, well, everything points at core. That's where all the common code is, so that's probably expected. But when it comes to data access, NOP core kind of touches, like, let's say, file system, config, and caching, where NOP data is just used for really data access and entity framework. But I really haven't seen too many other cleaner architectures out there. So every architecture has its caveats that you might not agree with, but this one is pretty clean. All right, so in walking through this, we're going to start at the front end and look at the different application entry points. And the way I kind of do this is that picture day one, you got hired on for a project, you're going to have to work with NOP Commerce, and you have less than an hour to kind of get up to speed of what this whole architecture is. So I'm not trying to show the most cool, fancy parts of NOP Commerce. I'm trying to show the parts that are most consistent, so you have a really good sense of the framework as a whole from the front end to the back end. So we're going to look at NOP Web and NOP Admin first, a little closer. If you make a NOP.web your startup project, and you had the sample data, you'll get that site or that base skin, whatnot. But the very first time you run it, this is kind of a cool thing, is that if it can't find where the database is, it's going to prompt you, where do you want to put the database, and also give you the choice of creating sample data. So the barrier of entry is again, pretty low. They made it pretty easy to just get up and running with this. The one thing that is a little odd is that for the 3.9 version, which is what we're covering mostly here, even though things really haven't changed in the 4.0 and 4.1 versions, the data connection string is actually stored in this file of appdatasettings.txt. Normally you look for the config where the connection string is, but it's in a different location. You could call this security by obfuscation because it's in a different spot than you would normally look. And the 4.0 version, which is the 4.0 version, is the version they prepared to go to .NET Core, and they prepared a lot of like for example, data settings.json is more of the standard location of where you put the connection string. So on the versioning aspect, again, we're going to be looking at 3.9. Not much has changed from 4.0. 4.0 is where they were preparing for .NET Core, where on the UI side, they did more with like tag helpers and things like that. And the 4.1 version that was just released now compiles the .NET Core. So, in looking at the architecture, you might have that tendency still to go to that home page. You're going to find that that's really just a big container for things called like widgets and actions. It's not a real good example when it comes to walking through an architecture. So I'm going to pick on the registration page. Pretty simple page, but it's consistent on how a lot of the architecture is in place. So when you're looking at an MVC architecture, a lot of times you're going to start at the controller, and then you're going to probably look at the model as well as then the view. So if we look at the customer controller, we got this register action result method. That is what returns this page. At the bottom of that, we see the view, which has a reference to that model getting passed to it as well. And that model was instantiated within this method. Nothing crazy here. That's really what I'm trying to point out here, is that when it comes to how MVC is applied within NOP Commerce, there's nothing out of the ordinary that I really found. However, when it comes to localization, supporting multiple languages, there's a pattern here, and that is worth checking out. And validation is where I found how that was implemented was something new to me. So when it comes to localization, supporting multiple languages, each of the different properties have an attribute on there that's kind of used as a key for doing a lookup for what language you want to show. So in the same last name example, we'll look at that label for extension method here in a bit. You got the editor, the required hint shows that little red asterisk. That validation message for it shows that last name is required, and we'll look at that a little closer. But first off, the label for is an extension method. I'm not going to read through code here because it's really not important to really just kind of clarify that that is how that particular key is used off the model. So how many of you work with multiple languages within your source code, within your code? It's usually not a whole lot, actually, but if you are doing it, it's good to maybe compare your current architecture to this architecture to see if there's anything, if there are any takeaways from this, good or bad. Fluent validation. Now this was new to me. This open source library from Jeremy Skinner provides a fluent way of applying validation to your models. So let's look at the example of this. So by using the fluent validation attributes, we then can put the attributes at the top of the model. So we have this register validator class that we're going to look at here shortly. That register validator class inherits the base not validator of type register model. So in a way, this kind of provides that two-way binding from the validator to the model. And if we look in here, we have this one line that shows the rule being applied to the last name and a fluent syntax. Now, this some people like, some people don't. That's a matter of preference. I've seen more and more code bases doing things more in a fluent way where you got a lot of lambda expressions and so on. But what I like about the validator here is that you notice the constructor, you're actually passing data, things you want to inject. So like the localization service, a list of states, customer settings. This allows for the validator on the model to be unit testable. It completely abstracts that off the model itself. So a lot of times you'll have attributes, whatnot, decorated around your model. Here, it's all kind of abstracted away into something that's focused on validation. So it's a library worth checking out to see if it makes sense for your software. On the administrator, not going to get much detail here, but this nop.admin is the project for that. And it provides that standard way of looking at an application where you got a navigator, you got search, and then you got a grid. The grid itself utilizes a library, Kendo UI. So it's a really good example architecture for how to use Kendo UI in the grid. They're using the community edition of Kendo UI because they get the paid for aspect and community as well. And to wrap up kind of application entry points. Now this part doesn't really have a user interface to it. This is a API plugin provided by Nop Templates. It's free. But I think what's most interesting about this plugin is where it basically exposes certain methods that, for example, get products, things like that, that you can have the web API for. So what you have to kind of get your head around is there's no recompiling of Nop Commerce itself to install this plugin. You install the plugin with its dependencies of web API, which Nop Commerce itself has no knowledge of, and then can then work as a web, and it can basically host a web API. So There's Elasticsearch. There's a lot of other technologies you might want to integrate within NopCommerce that you can actually integrate at the level without even touching the source code. You can integrate it as a plugin. So if anybody's even trying to figure out how to extend their software with some kind of plugin architecture, I think it's worth checking out this architecture to see how that is even accomplished. All right, so to wrap up this part in the UI, this MVC request lifecycle I think is really good to check out if you want to get more comfortable with MVC. And when it comes to extension methods, I thought this was really good, especially how it related to NopCommerce on how you can create extension points within MVC in some creative ways. Business logic. This is kind of my favorite part in a weird way. You'll see why. Could be. So a little bit of, we're going to be looking at Nop services and Nop core here shortly, but a little bit of a recap. We got Nop.web that you have the controller basically creating the model, and it's also going to return the view that also has a reference to that model. Typical MVC stuff. That controller needs to get its data from somewhere. The controller is going to work with getting its data through something called a service, a factory, a helper. There's multiple different names for what we have up here is just as a box of a service, but that service is then going to get its data from most likely the database of like Nop data, and we'll look at Nop data a little later. So the service will then populate domain entities that then get filled into the model. So what I like about this architecture is that separation of concerns is heavily in place throughout this whole architecture, which is rare to find sometimes. So you got dependency injection and inversion of control. Now this is typically how I hear this being talked about. You get a definition, they get a bunch of boxes being drawn to really communicate this. So dependency injection, and which is something we're going to basically pass through the constructors. And inversion of control is simply a framework around dependency injection. It's best to understand this by looking at code. So we're going to kind of continue with that same example. That's why I'm looking at the customer controller versus maybe one of the services. But here we have the customer controller. Its constructor has like 30 plus odd things that gets passed to it. Probably a little more. I mean, it needs all of these things for what that controller does. So yes, we pass all the dependencies when it's going to get any kind of data. And the example we had earlier is that we had that customer model factory that had the method that populated the model. So that was the method that did the data access. There's no database connections and things like that getting instantiated within this controller or anywhere else. It's all getting injected, most likely through an interface for that class. Why do we do this? Yeah, this is the guy that has to deal with it. So why do we do this? Why do we make this so hard? Software development wasn't this hard 10, 20 years ago. Why do we make it so hard now? You know why, come on. Testing. You need to be able to basically write unit tests, and this is an example of one of the tests from the solution there where they mock the repositories and have a test method set up to test that customer service and unit. Yep, we'll look at that a little closer later. So this allows for complete control of your data. So the architecture of NopCommerce is well done to be unit tested. Well, dependency injection is everywhere. So here we are back looking at the list of things that get injected. But what about even something like, let's say if we were to look at like order service. The order service itself, I'm sure, has to do other things and work with other repositories for what needs to work with. So you have to worry about now the dependencies of the dependencies of all these things. So what if we just looked at something like the address model factory? Sounds really simple of what that does. So I went to the source code. This code is actually not in NopCommerce. I wanted a default constructor of the customer controller where a developer didn't have to worry about instantiating those classes. So I thought, okay, address model factory. I purposely put the dependency on separate lines here. I didn't think it'd go this far. So I'm just typing in the dependency of the dependencies. I purposely left the DB connection string is there because that way it'll show how many, that's a database connection that's really to be handled there. So after doing all this work and looking at here are the, again, the dependency is the dependency. There's like 2, maybe 300.
That's tedious.
Yes, it was very tedious. I think I watched a whole show of something while doing this. I didn't bother to do the rest. I wanted to get this thing to compile. So that's why when you go down the road of dependency injection, you need some kind of framework eventually. For an enterprise level application, yes, your control and your services will start to get uglier for the amount of data that you want to pass to them. You need something that helps the sanity, helps why are we going down this dependency injection route? You want to do that for the value of unit testing, but as you saw, things can get out of control very fast, and you need something like AutoFact as a framework around how you're doing dependency injection. So AutoFact is implemented in OpCommerce. They have this pattern in the code to where if you have this, I did a search in the solution for the dependency register, and there's this register method that is standard throughout all the different aspects of the code. So like the web, the admin has their register method class, and as one of the parameters passed to it is the AutoFact container builder. So basically, you're just adding the dependencies to the container, and things really kind of magically get resolved. In this example that we're looking at earlier, where we had the address model factory, 1 line of code. If we registered if we didn't register, let's say, a service or something like that that uses beforehand, that line would break at runtime. That's good. So we know at runtime that all of its dependencies are going to be available, and we don't have to worry about the craziness of the child dependencies. So AutoFact itself, you can register by criteria. It's probably the best way to describe that example. A popular way is to register by type. Anything of that type, register that as a dependency. Here's a very common one. Register all the controllers that are currently up in memory. So 1 line of code, all the controllers, it will simply try to register them for its dependencies. More commonly, it's going to be the data access layer. AutoFact and many other IOC frameworks are thought of how you're going to manage your database connections. So that is basically being handled down there. AutoMapper. Now, how many of you heard of this one? This is a pretty popular one. So this really helps on typing in that whatever that object name is, dot last name equals that other object name, dot last name, all that repetitive mapping, AutoMapper takes care of for you. What I liked in OpCommerce is how it's implemented. So here we have an extension method when it comes to that manufacturer domain entity to where how it populates the model. So it's 1 line of code that calls this other 1 line of code up here for AutoMapper itself. So we don't have to have AutoMapper throughout the whole project. Basically, we're kind of, whatever's doing the mapping, it could be AutoMapper or something else, but we kind of have that contained within this extension method to where as a developer, when you're working with this code, this 2 model, it's pretty clean to where you have this manufacturer service that get manufacturer by ID, returning that domain entity of manufacturer, and then you got this 1-liner of 2 model, working with that extension method. So AutoMapper in a way is kind of abstracted from the architecture itself. They're like. So a little bit of recap, you got the service, it fills in the domain entities, and then that domain entity is then filled into the model. So that separation is a big factor in this architecture. But we haven't talked about anything that has logic yet, really. So here's an example, kind of maybe a lame example, but a popular one. Delete customer. Now I've seen a lot of systems, you do soft deletes to where here it'll mark a delete flag as true, and then it'll tack on the dash deleted onto the email and username, and then update the record versus really delete the record. This is logic. Some people might argue, no, this is data access, but this is logic of your application, how you want to handle deletion. That customer is a domain entity that's getting passed to it. And what I like about this is what I want to really point out, is that the domain entities themselves are pretty dumb. They just are properties that are basically lists But there's no real logic you're going to find inside the domain entities. When you're trying to troubleshoot something and figure out where is the business logic, you're not digging through domain entities, you're just digging through these service type classes. So even that clean code is implemented pretty well within this architecture. All right, so to wrap up this part, this is a really good Pluralsight course when it comes to comparing all the different IOC containers out there. So AutoFact, NNJect, Unity is one he covers a lot in here as well. It's not really that popular anymore, but it's a really good course. Getting a little bit dated, but it's a really good course to check out to maybe decide on a IOC container for your code base. Data access. So for those of you that use Entity Framework, I will be very curious if you have seen Entity Framework implemented this way. The database structure itself is very straightforward. It almost maps exactly to the domains. There are some aspects of how data is stored that's not real, not obvious, I guess you'd say. But for the most part, it's a pretty clean database structure. It's pretty easy to follow. It does use Entity Framework, as we mentioned here. And it does use Entity Framework Core in the 4.1 version. So they kind of carried that forward. So back to where we are, that service has to get its data from somewhere. It's going to use the repository pattern to get its data, and then that repository pattern uses a domain mapper class that actually ties metadata on top of the domain entity itself. So the repository doesn't create more data in memory here than fill data into the domain entity like the domain entity does to the model. It uses the domain mapper class to tie metadata into the entity. So when it comes to how big that field can be, like so many characters or if it's required, that's the value you get out of a domain mapper class. So we're going to see that example here pretty soon. So looking at how Entity Framework is implemented. So here we are at the customer service class, and we got the customer by ID calling the customer repository and the get by ID method. That customer repository is really based upon an interface of type customer. So you have this I repository of type customer. And I've seen this a lot, to where you have a standard way for your entities to, when it comes to like get by ID, that's just off the interface itself for that to be implemented. If we looked a little closer at that I repository interface, we see you got the get by ID. If we were to scroll through here, we'd see you got insert, update, delete. It's providing that standard pattern for your entities for CRUD operations, for your data access. That I repository is implemented by this EF repository. So we're EF being Entity Framework around this, and that get by ID, it's kind of funny here. That kind of shows that when it comes to get by ID, it's using the entities.find method, and you have like comments of like why they did things the way they did in the source code. I think that's kind of funny. You got articles there to learn more about why we did it this way by checking out the Stack Overflow article that is in the source code. When we look at this EF repository a little closer, we see we have this table property exposed, which is iQueryable of a type, which is really just pointing to entities, this.entities, which is of IDB set type. So this is more Entity Framework-like. This is what I haven't seen before. This is what I'm curious if any of you have seen it this way. Here we are in the service layer, in the business logic. We have this method called getCustomerByGUID. And we are doing basically a link to objects query where we have that iTable as part of this that makes it queryable. We're able to do this in the business logic layer. I'm going to have a criteria-based query because it's not really Entity Framework we're using here. We're just doing a link to objects, getting projected to Entity Framework, which is really doing the query. So in theory, you could use Entity Framework, you could use Hibernate, you could use Dapper, you could use whatever is implementing that interface. So Entity Framework is abstracted away from the business logic to where you can do criteria type queries. I don't know if that's good or not. It's impressive as all get out that you can do that, I think. But should you? Should you be allowing developers within the business logic kind of think of and create the queries on the fly outside of the repositories themselves? This was new to me. Was this new to anybody else? Seeing entity framework abstracted away even one step further? No? Okay, I don't feel alone then. I have to admit that by giving this talk quite a few times, there's just like a certain profile of a person that always kind of raises their hand. And it's usually someone younger that just came out of college and they say, my professor taught me that's how I should use entity framework. Blew me away that entity framework was being taught at that level of how you even abstract entity framework from your business logic. So I don't know if I like this or not. It's interesting, but again, I think a lot of DBAs, I think our DBA left, but I think he'd be screaming right now if he saw something like this being handled in business logic. Anyway, so you got the repository. That's going to basically return, or it's going to work with this domain mapper class, and taking a closer look at that. We got this customer map class that, for example, on the system name, it's tacking on the metadata that it can only be 400 characters. And this is not a NOP Commerce thing, even though you see that it inherits a NOP entity type configuration. That's really also inheriting a class that's entity framework related. So this is a feature of entity framework where you can have a fluent way of tacking on metadata to your domain entities. And that's one aspect I do like about this architecture is they were consistent on this fluent nature of not only on the front end with validation, but also here on the back end when it comes to populating the domain entities. They kind of stayed with that aspect. Your model, the domains could have been decorated with this information. That is more common how you see this type of these type of data rules, I guess you'd say, around domains. You see it as attributes, but here it's implemented this way. So on the data access side, there's a lot more to dig into. There's image files because you can store them in the file system or within the database. Configuration management is pretty extensive within this architecture, so that's a really good example to check out. There's some aspects that kind of built around Azure and Azure Table Storage. Caching, Redis. How many have heard of Redis? This is a solution when it comes to kind of caching data at a key value pair level. What I find most interesting here is that when you look at this architecture, you kind of realize how simple it is to implement Redis. So it's a really good example to see how easy it is or how easy they make it look to implement Redis. So it's a good example for that if you're looking at implementing that. Entity framework in the enterprise, that's a good one to check out. That relates to how things are structured within NOP Commerce itself. And next we'll move on to test coverage as we wrap some of this up. So when you talk about test coverage, I feel like this always needs to be mentioned first at least, the different testing layers. So you have functional testing. That's kind of really from the UI perspective. So on web apps, you're looking at Selenium. That's the most popular engine for that. Test Stack. How many have heard of Test Stack? This is an open source library. I'm doing functional testing to where on the web side, it kind of creates this page model way of doing things. It uses Selenium under the covers, but it also, if you're testing desktop apps, such as WinForms or WPF, it's a library for that as well. And it's crazy fast for UI automation. There's coded UI that Microsoft provides. Test Stack, free and open source, is about 10 times faster. It's worth checking out. Then you have integration testing. And integration testing, that's when you're hitting something outside the code. You're hitting a database, you're hitting the file system, you're hitting a web service. Date time. If you're doing datetime.now in your logic, how are you going to test that? Unless you're changing the system clock all the time. Think of any resources outside of that you have to go outside of your code to get. That's integration testing. That's a form of integration. So a lot of us, when it comes to aspects of the databases, yes, we see how that's integration, but it's file systems, it's web services, anything outside that code. And that's where you can then get into unit testing. So unit testing is where you're truly mocking data. A lot of times your managers say, hey, when are we going to create a bunch of unit tests around our application? If none of your application is, for example, implementing dependency or using dependency injection, I have no idea how you're really going to do this. You probably have to step back a little bit, maybe say, hey, why don't we do some integration tests as we try to refactor some stuff to do some unit tests? You might have to go a high level to the user interface and test things that way first. So having these layers in mind are very important to really think about how you're approaching testing. Not Commerce itself, when it comes to the test suite, it's really just unit test. From what I've seen, it's mostly unit test. So they use NUnit, an example of a test. We have a lot of different repositories that are going to be mocked up. We got a setup class for that. So a very typical structure I've seen for NUnit, or just creating a unit test. When we look at an example unit test, one thing I kind of got out of this is that we have this, for example, where you would normally see an assert. At the end of a test, you have some kind of assert to validate. Here we have an extension method should equal that. Basically, we have these test extensions that provide probably more guidance within the tests themselves. I kind of like this, to where a lot of times there's so much of a focus on naming conventions around tests and things like that, but having just some common codes or some common aspects on how you want to handle asserts and things like that, have some test extensions is really an easy way to go to have some common code for your test. In order to get test coverage for NUnit, you have to just to run tests within, you have to install the adapter, the NUnit 3 test adapter. So I did that. This is the 3.9 production ready code that just took it, installed it, or ran it, installed the database, did nothing more to it. And out of the box, what do you see? A handful of failed tests on the production ready code of 3.9. Now, when you first see this, it's open source. And what I mean by that is, it's kind of like, this is an area to get involved with. If it's a open source project that you really want to help out NOP and many other solutions, this is usually the best area to get involved in that project if you really want to contribute. So yes, out of the box, I saw those handful of failed tests. I said, okay, I'm going to look past that. But if you look at the overall coverage for the solution, it's 20%. Not making you feel any better, right? Again, this is the most popular .NET-based e-commerce solution out there. It's used on in the tens of thousands of sites. Yes, he's probably ready to crawl under his desk right now. So for the solution itself, okay, let's look a little further. What if we looked at where a lot of the business logic is? We looked at the services library, 9%. Definitely not making you feel any better, I'm sure. And if we looked at something, we're looking at like the customer service class, we're looking at this quite a bit. That's 4% coverage. Now, if we look at something that's going to make us feel better, here we have this method of get customer by email, 96% covered. Got a nice number there, don't we? That should make you feel good. Well, let's take a closer look at that. With the coverage applied, we got the one condition to check that's not getting checked. So that is 96% covered. There's only one thing to test here. Really, we're not testing that. So my point is that 96 is a great number, right? But you really should always look at the coverage, because that's a false positive. You think 96 is awesome for that, but it means nothing. So my point of really all of this is that, yeah, low numbers are bad. You want to always increase the low numbers, but don't get fooled by the high numbers either. You should always take a look at the coverage itself to see what it's really doing for you.
And the marketing materials say now 96% coverage.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll be honest with you, when you look at a method, it's either 100 or it's not. That's the only way you're truly going to know that that is really tested. Yeah, there you go. You could just you could change those up, exactly. That's usually the fix, right? Mm-hmm. So don't get fooled by the numbers. I think any test around any code should be looked at further, if it's not 100%. So in Pluralsight, they got this awesome course of end-to-end testing that kind of breaks down that functional integration and UI testing a little bit further. Test Stack, there's a course on that out there I thought was really good. You could just go to teststack.io, I think it is, and download it. It's a really cool solution. Extensibility, I'll briefly touch on this, then wrap things up. So they have a lot of examples out on their site of how you can think about putting different themes around NOP Commerce. There's 735 that are out there that you can check out. Again, I think for what was mentioned at the conference, I think it was like 30,000 active sites are using NopCommerce, if I remember right. But I would say they're more your small, medium-sized operations. Some big names were shared, but I can't remember those. I'm a little too focused on the code there. So within the solution, you have something like the Nevo slider. That's kind of more of a UI-based. That's what you see on the front page or the home page for how that plugin is. That's its primary purpose. And there is a plugin out here called Fixed Store by Weight. And the reason I highlight that one is because that's an example of a plugin that shows you how you can extend NopCommerce from the UI all the way to the database side. So you'll find business logic in here, a little bit of UI, and when it comes to that plugin, it has to work with its own table. So at the time of install of that plugin, it uses entity migrations to install the table that that plugin needs. So this architecture of how you put this plugin architecture to where you can customize so much and follow the same patterns of NopCommerce itself is pretty awesome, and that's a good example to check out further if you want to see that. So the NopCommerce Marketplace has a bunch of paid-for stuff and free stuff that you can check out further. A lot of the free stuff is also open source code behind that usually. I came across this course on Pluralsight and when it comes to plugin development. Matter of fact, I saw this course and I really had no desire to give this talk because I thought this course was done so good. But it's getting a little bit dated now, but it is kind of picks up where this talk is leaving off when it comes to getting further into plugin development. So themes are more about the front end, and plugins are really more about business logic and the back end. All right, summary. So in wrapping this up, we have so in summary, this is where things kind of changed for me, and I even changed the ending of this for what I was giving last year, because I wasn't planning on giving this talk after November, after this conference. Andre, the founder on the left-hand side, kind of got me more involved in NopCommerce. I was basically shared, I was looking for an open source solution. I was looking at creating some training content around it. And he's like, well, would you want to give a talk at the conference? So after kind of going back and forth with him, 4.0 version was released at the conference. Going back and forth with him, he's like, yeah, I'll give a talk. So that technical portion of the walkthrough, the front end, the back end, was the talk at the conference. So the original plan, and really still the plan, it's just been delayed, is create this full stack developer series using NopCommerce as the base software. And I was working with Pluralsight at the time to be an author to pull this content together. The first course is going to be ASP.NET versus ASP.NET Core, so you can kind of compare the two different technologies and how things have changed. And from there would be other refactoring examples. So for example, we have the architecture of NopCommerce itself. What if you wanted to change out jQuery and Razor View Engine to something like AngularJS? What would that look like at an enterprise level? You see a lot of Hello World examples of this, but you don't really see it at an enterprise level example. So instead of AngularJS, what about a React? You got then Angular 2+. I think it's almost getting up to 7 now. So I know it's at 6 with TypeScript, or then you could even do Vue.js. So when it comes to this comparing technologies, a lot of times you just see, again, compared at a really small level. And I'm working towards where you can compare these technologies at a much larger level. One thing I also want to mention is that, who's heard of Blazor? I think there would be a good number of hands there. So the one thing about NopCommerce, matter of fact, I sent Andre an email. I was like, hey, have you seen Blazor? And Jeff Fritz, I know he's popular here. I forwarded him his what he did on Twitch, right? What he recorded on Blazor. And Andre responded, that's awesome. So what's really cool about NopCommerce right now, even though I haven't selected one of the big ones like Angular or React or Vue, I really think Nop is really primed to implement something like Blazor when that is ready. So I think the worlds will kind of come together in a nice way to where that could be a very viable option for NopCommerce once that is ready. That would be nice to see. So we also got AutoFact. What if you switched out AutoFact and Inject? Would be a cool one to see what that looks like. You got any framework? What if you take out that, put in Hibernate? And then you got Dapper. The community itself of NopCommerce, for whatever reason, they really like Dapper, just like you like Dapper probably. But nonetheless, you know, it is what the community really wants. If they're going to go down that path, who knows? But nonetheless, I thought it'd be neat to see how this architecture would look with it. Then you got SQL Server. Well, if we took that out and put in something like Oracle, usually get a couple moans. Yeah, all right, good. What if we put in Postgres? Something like that is a little more practical. Matter of fact, Postgres will be supported in the 4.2 version. Postgres and MySQL will be an option within the next release. So that was the original plan after I gave the talk. That's been postponed pretty much to 2019. Matter of fact, I'm not even really working with Pluralsight anymore. I'm just going to be self-publishing some of the stuff under iCompare Solutions. But what's been interesting is that 3 months later, I've been this happy contractor for, subcontractor for the last 10 years. Gave the talk at the conference in November. Then I find myself 3 months later for my career primarily focusing on NOP Commerce itself, to where I'm pretty much just focusing on consulting within that NOP Commerce space. And along with that, I'm working on training that is really for NOP itself, on not only for the store owners, but to kind of give that more developer perspective of how that code works behind the store. And I'm also doing a lot more with coaching, to where I'm coaching individuals and teams by using NOP Commerce as the basis for that training. So I identified a learning path for someone that hasn't done any programming at all in the past, and to where I'm kind of an option for the different coding schools, I guess you would say, to where you're an individual that doesn't know software development. I'm using Pluralsight as a learning path, and it's basically a 6-month duration, to where as a student, you really know nothing about software development. At the end of 6 months, you can at least debug and work with the NOP Commerce code, because that's the focus throughout the whole 6 months. And it's a one-on-one thing, so I'm sounding kind of salesy here. I apologize for that. This has been the biggest focus of mine right now. But nonetheless, I also guarantee, I have 100% guarantee that in 6 months, if this is not what you're looking for.
That's better than 90% coverage.
You like that better? Yes. 90% guarantee, or 96% guarantee. I should use that one. Oh, this criteria you didn't meet. So yes, that's something I'm offering now. But this is really about you. When it comes down to it, find an open source project, apply that project, and then promote it, because you really just don't know what it's going to lead to next. If you're interested in the conference itself, they did release the 4.1 version that compiles the core. I had them create this code for me, so you get 20% off if you really want to go to that. I still think NOP Commerce, even though it's been around for about 10 years, there are very few hands that went up that knew about this. It really feels like it's still in its infancy on getting involved in this solution and working with it. So it's worth checking out. This whole presentation of what I recorded back in 2017, you can actually just see the slides on my voiceover of that. You go to nopjohn.com, it'll just redirect you to YouTube, and you can watch this presentation there, or rewatch this video, of course. So, and thank you. Any questions? Nope.
Very well done. I really like the way you did the slides. Very clear.
Thanks.
So hopefully you enjoyed all this. Everybody going to clean up nice for the Microsoft people. And again, we'd like to really thank our sponsor. And what was the sponsor's name? I can't hear you. What was the sponsor's name?
TechBash.
Come on, real loud.
All right, I've got a few more notes I scribbled on my paper here. So sponsors, Bill mentioned how it is getting sponsors these days. We have a couple spots left, so if you want to do something like throw something in a swag bag, just email sponsor@techbash.com. And along the family activities line, last year we had Jewelbots on Friday for kids to do some activities. This year we have a whole day of Friday activities for kids. So you can come bring kids. We've got things like Connects building, scavenger hunt, self-defense court,